Breathe. Sitting in the hospital room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of monitors, I held my breath. The face on the pillow, at least the parts not obscured by tubes, was ghostly pale. The thin, seemingly lifeless arms by his sides were frightening to me. What happened to the strength he'd possessed? The strength in which I had spent my childhood relying? The strength which tossed me into the air, caught me effortlessly before I fell, terrified me when I knew I was in trouble? That strength was disappearing. I felt lightheaded and reminded myself to breathe. There was hope still, wasn't there? He was no longer partially paralyzed. He was awake for precious snatches of time. Yes, there was hope. Breathe. I tore my tear-filled eyes away from the unfamiliar, fragile figure on the bed. I mustered all my strength to stand and peer out the window. How could it be so bright outside? Life was everywhere. Birds soared and swooped and danced, singing of a hope and happiness I no longer possessed. The sun spread light and warmth all around, but not into this cold, dark room, not into my aching heart. I turned my eyes back to the room as the door creaked open and a nurse interrupted my grief. She smiled a painful, knowing smile. Or was that just my interpretation? She whispered something I couldn't comprehend. She whispered and smiled at me. Her smile faltered as she crept close enough to see my face. Was it as pale and fragile as he? I reminded myself to breathe. She patted my arm and refastened her smile before she turned away from my pain. She checked the monitors with their hopeful beeping. She touched his pale, unfamiliar face. I watched with detachment, with confusion and fear, with longing and anxiety. I watched and held my breath. I watched his life disappearing. She looked up and smiled and spoke again. I shook my head, not understanding. My terrified, red-rimmed eyes latched onto her face and waited. She walked around the bed and to my side. She put her hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. "He's stable and not in pain. It will be okay," she smiled. "Breathe! Hope!" I commanded. "There's life there still." She released me, with her smile still in place. She released me and turned away. I breathed in deeply and sighed. With tear-filled eyes I spun toward the door. I had to say something before she left. I stuttered and choked out the only words I could manage. I cried out for her to wait. "How do you know he's not in pain?" I croaked. "Please don't lie to spare me," I sobbed. She smiled again, this time in understanding. She smiled, but with my pain in her eyes. She glanced at the emaciated figure on the bed before speaking. She glanced at the image seared into my heart. "Well, there's the morphine for one," she kidded. She looked back at me and smiled. "Megan, it will be okay," she promised. "This isn't over. Your father is very strong." She winked and smiled before turning away. The door creaked open and closed. I breathed again while tears streamed down my cheeks. I breathed and remembered that smile. Somehow, I found my way back to my chair, the chair which felt like a coffin. I picked up my pen to write down what she'd said. I picked up my pen to remember. The beeping continued like a metronome. His breathing was slow and even. I stood up and walked slowly to his side. I walked with leaden feet. His lashes were dark against his white cheeks. I hoped that he was dreaming. I reached out carefully to cradle his face. I reached out for the face I loved. His lips were chapped and pale and stiff. I held my breath and cried. With a heavy heart and unseeing eyes, I grabbed the chapstick his nurse had left. With slow precision, I moistened his lips, hoping against hope they would speak again. I grabbed a damp cloth, then I wiped and cleaned his closed eyes, hating the fact that this was all I could do. With another reminder to keep on breathing, I laid these aids aside. I turned away for another moment to wipe my own wet eyes, and with a deep, painful breath, I reached out my hand to hold his cold one in mine. I hated that coldness. I hated my helplessness. I hated the air in that room. While staring at our hands, our interlocked fingers, I breathed and cried again. I reminded myself to remember this hand, to remember these fingers, to remember him. I soaked in the feel of his hand in mine. I was drowning in the pain I felt. I recalled images of his life and laughter. I breathed for the love he'd shared. That love was in me. I felt it still. I knew it would always be there. With that in mind, I smiled down at his face. I smiled for his life and mine. I had to say something. He had to know I was there. I was terrified that he might feel alone. I told myself to breathe while I gathered the strength to speak. I told myself to be brave. "Daddy," I choked. Was that all I could manage? Damn, how could this be so hard? "Daddy," I uttered, with more strength and purpose. "Daddy, I'm here. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, don't give up now." Feeling drained and exhausted, battling my tears, I squeezed his hand with everything I had. "Daddy, do you hear me? There's life in you still. Daddy, I need you to stay." These words seemed to echo in every corner of the room. These words were full of my pain. These words, these pleas, were my grief screaming. These words were all I had. I looked up at the ceiling, speckled with water stains and despair. I looked up and breathed a sigh. With a heavy heart, I decided to return to my coffin. I decided to sit back down and write. But before I could force my body to move, before I convinced myself to release his hand, he twitched the fingers held by mine. He twitched, and I released my breath. My amazed, tear-filled eyes glanced down at our hands, just in time to watch his fingers gently contract. There was strength in that hand. There was love and hope. There was life still. "Daddy," I breathed. "Daddy, are you with me?" I sobbed and continued to stare at our fingers, too afraid to look at his face. He gurgled a sound and barely shifted his body. He gurgled the sound of life. My eyes, of their own accord, forced me to stare at his face. His eyes were open, looking at me. His eyes were filled with love and hope. He gurgled again as I continued to cry. He gurgled as I leaned down to kiss him. He squeezed my hand and closed his eyes. He squeezed my hand and I sighed. "Daddy, do you hear me? I love you, Daddy, and I know you love me too." His eyes slowly reopened, glassy and medicated. His eyes searched for me. I leaned down toward him. I leaned over him with love. His eyes met mine and seemed to smile. "There's life in there," I told myself. "There's life and hope and love." As I breathed in relief, he squeezed my hand again. As I breathed in relief, he sighed.